the next question is also related to technology, but also your previous research, also to your book, because touch, again, as we already talked with you, is very context related. It's really important. Who is touching you, when it happens, right? And all these aspects, in what situation. And I think your book also touches upon those differences, right? In terms of like cultural differences for touch, but also universal similarities, which are also very important. Could you please touch upon them briefly? What are the universal similarities for touch and the differences, specifically cultural differences?
Yes, I mean, I suppose kicking off with some of the similarities. I mean, so a lot of the similarities come in forms of things like, I suppose, physical expressions of affection. So if you actually look at it, there's a lot of you know, similarities, at least in terms of things like holding hands, hugging, kissing, these types of behaviors as forms of affection across different cultures.
So all cultures like hugs. Are there any cultures that
Well,
don't like hugs?
we need to. I think we need to be careful to say all cultures like hugs, because it's just like saying I don't think we could say all individuals like hugs, even within a culture, right? There will be some individuals that don't, right? So touch is it's loaded with emotion. There's past experiences, present experiences, future experiences, a lot of stuff that folds into it. But it is true that actually, I mean, one of the questions that we asked in the touch test, which was really quite simple. I mean, we said, what does touch mean to you? Give us just 3 basic words, right? Really simple question. But around the world, consistently, things like comfort, affection, support, warmth, love, these were the words that came out. They were there for men, women, non-binary adults. They were there for people with visual impairment, mobility impairment, you know, across all sorts of different groups. Those words came out. So universally, maybe not universally, but across a whole range of world regions, we tend to think about some of these comforting forms of touch, right? There can be a level of comfort, and there can also be some similarities in feelings of appropriateness about touch. So there are studies comparing different cultures and what they think is appropriate or not appropriate, and where on the body, for instance, someone is okay to touch you if they're a stranger, or if they're a partner, or if they're a friend or a sibling. And you see there's lots of similarities in this. A lot of this work has come out of labs in Finland, where they've compared, for instance, European and Japanese adults, or they've compared across different European regions. And you find that, you know, as you might expect, you know, we find more of the body to be appropriate for people to touch if we have a closer emotional bond to them than if we don't. So emotional bonds, that's a pretty cultural similarity there. But there are, of course, differences. And some of those differences are, for instance, cultural norms. You know, in some cultures, a handshake is an acceptable thing. In other cultures, people don't want to engage in that. For some, I don't know, some cultures will kind of do the kind of air kiss on the cheek style interaction as a greeting, right? So there are differences in some of these kind of dynamics that kick out. There's also differences in terms of the frequency of touch. So for instance, there's some quite well-known work going back to the 1960s, and there's some debates about this now, but it was a study which looked at how often people touched in coffee shops over an hour. And they found, for instance, in Puerto Rico, people were touching around about 160 times an hour, versus in the UK, they were touching 0 times an hour, right? And I should flag, more recent research suggests that actually it's probably not that much of a difference. And actually, there were some methodological questions over that original work in the 1960s, but it's just an example, right? There are some of these differences, and you do see some of those things come out. So there's some variation in it, but I think one of the things about touch is I think we do place a lot of focus on culture as being some of the driving factors in differences, and certainly cultural norms and context can play a role. But as we said already, even within a culture, there can be lots of other factors that arguably might matter more when it comes to our preferences. So one of the things that really matters about our preferences towards touch are things like our personality types. So whether you're more extroverted or introverted, our attachment styles can also play a role. So some
attachment
people,
styles?
Yeah, so attachment styles relate to, I suppose, our behaviors when we're in relationships, whether we're looking for physical closeness, whether we want to be more standoff from our partners, more aloof, all of these different types of behaviors people might choose. And we can obviously flex throughout our lives, and we might have different, I suppose, preferences at one time than another, but typically you find that people who are more, what people say, more avoidant in their attachment style, so people who tend to be, they want to be more independent from their partners. You know, for instance, they were less impacted by the COVID lockdowns and the lack of touch than, let's say, someone who has a more anxious attachment style and is seeking reassurance from a partner more often. So there's nuances like that, but things like attachment, things like personality, these types of factors tend to be perhaps, you know, arguably more prominent when it comes to asking questions like, do you prefer
more than even cultural aspects, right?
Yeah, I mean, cultural aspects matter. I don't want to reduce them, but I think, yeah, certainly those cultural differences are there, but there's also quite a lot of cultural similarities. So then within that culture, it's all about those other nuances like personality, gender, age, all these factors, and that can play a role.
And I assume there are like standardized questionnaires that you probably also use, right? Because it's so important to probably differentiate that for your studies, right?
For sure, yeah. So there's all sorts of measures. There's all sorts of measures about people's touch experiences and attitudes, and you know, they might break down to things like childhood touch, you know, touch with friends and family, touch with strangers, right? There's other measures that look at social touch attitudes, and then of course, yeah, there are and those are standardized measures, and then there's also standardized questionnaire measures looking at things like personality, looking at attachment, and these have all been used in various studies, empathy, etc. There's all sorts of different ways that you can touch into that.
Right. Great, thank you. These already methodological aspects, but they're extremely important when you like think about your recruitment strategies, right, for your studies.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, no, for sure.
So.